oxygenated. And so we'll draw those structures in red. And those are left-sided structures. Okay? Now you will notice that the aorta, which is leaving the heart, crosses from left side. It is to the right of the pulmonary trunk, but essentially everything else is left-sided versus right-sided. So you'll need to recognize which structures are, or chambers, which vessels or chambers contain oxygenated blood and which ones contain deoxygenated blood. And after we're done with this and you have time to look at the models, I'll take you through those same structures and the sequence that a single drop of blood or a single red blood cell would go through. It's already in your lecture notes, but just helping you find those structures as you look in the heart. All right, so deoxygenated. Is going to enter the heart from the upper torso, the head, the neck and upper extremities, and the chest wall. Is going to enter the heart via the superior vena cava. So this is superior vena cava, and blood is entering into the heart. We have 3 vessels, all right, in the right atrium that receive blood. So these are receiving chambers. All right, so the right atrium receives blood via the superior vena cava. And that is blood that is coming from the head, upper extremities, and chest. And that will make more sense when we get to the blood vessels, when we actually trace what blood vessels are coming together to form the superior vena cava. So that would be this vessel right here. Okay? If you'll notice, it's in a straight line with the inferior vena cava. This forms the right border or margin of the heart. These vessels and the right atrium. Okay. So superior vena cava brings blood into the right atrium. Inferior vena cava is going to bring blood into the right atrium. So inferior vena cava is going to bring blood from the abdominal cavity and organs and the lower extremities. Okay. And all of that will come into the right atrium. Now I said that there were 3 vessels that carry blood to the heart. And the third is carrying blood from the heart itself. All right, so the blood has its own, the heart has its own circulation. Arteries coming off of the aorta, going to the heart muscle, giving up oxygen, coming back to the surface of the heart as veins. So that opening, it's not shown on this diagram here, but I'll show it to you in a moment, is right near the opening for the inferior vena cava. So if this was our opening for the inferior vena cava, it's right next to that. And that is known as the coronary sinus. It's like a very large vein. And that is coming from the heart. So, following on the models that you have, find the superior vena cava. It's going to be this upright vessel here. All right, on the smaller hearts, it's colored blue. On the large hearts, it's confusing because it has a bunch of other vessels coming into it. So here's the right margin of the heart formed by the right atrium. And coming into the right atrium is the superior vena cava from the top. And from the bottom, it's not very large because it's cut just above the diaphragm. The rest of the inferior vena cava is down in the abdominal cavity. So this would be the inferior vena cava. Okay? So that forms a straight line pretty much between the two. I will, just a sec. So the sinus posteriorly is found on the back of the heart. So turn your hearts around or lift them up off. It's going to be on the bottom if your heart's sitting like this. So the posterior surface of the heart is formed primarily of the left atrium and 2/3 of the left ventricle. So here's the left atrium. You'll see a large blue structure. All right, that's a dilated vein. And it's disappearing right here, right by the inferior vena cava. So that's the coronary sinus on the outside. To see it on the inside, open up the wall of the right atrium. It would be the blue one above where you were down. And then look down inside, and next to the inferior vena cava on the large heart, it's 83, that small blue opening, that small blue dot of pink is referencing the opening for the coronary sinus. Okay?
Next to it is inferior.
The larger one next to it is the inferior. Now on the smaller hearts, it would be number 58. All right, so here's the superior vena cava on the smaller heart in the back. Not superior vena cava. Superior vena cava, the coronary sinus. This would be the inferior vena cava. You look inside. Right here with the larger opening would be the blood in the inferior vena cava, that larger red circle. And the smaller red circle, number 58, would be the opening of the coronary sinus. Okay. On our real sheep hearts, you can actually see an opening about the diameter of a number 2 pencil. All right, and then you can put a metal probe in there when we're doing the dissection on Tuesday. So on this diagram, let me roll my stuff over the table. So on this diagram from Netter's, the heart is in its anatomical position. Here would be the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. And the right atrium has been cut into a flap-like door that opens up. And here's the inferior vena cava, and right beside it is the opening of the coronary sinus. Okay? So we're getting 3 vessels emptying into the chamber of the right atrium, all 3 of which are bringing deoxygenated blood. Now we need to get blood into the left atrium. So here's the left atrium on this particular diagram. And on your models, it's posterior. So if you're trying to, you've got someone on the surgical table and their chest has been cut open, if you put your hands down behind the heart, you would be touching the left atrium and most of the left ventricle. So on these smaller models, it's this brownish, tannish color structure. All of this is left atrium. Okay? And so blood is returning to the left atrium from the lungs on the right side and from the lungs on the left side. And these are identified as pulmonary veins, even though they're carrying oxygenated blood. Right? They are pulmonary veins. Because they are carrying blood back to the heart. Are they under low pressure or high pressure? Low pressure. And that changes the structure of the vessel when it's low pressure. All right? Because it doesn't need as much smooth muscle. The connective tissue is different. The wrapping of the smooth muscle is more loose than tight like it is in arteries because it's resisting less pressure. Thank you. And so we call it a vein because of the structure, not whether the blood is oxygenated or not. Okay? So blood is returning to the left atrium from the left lungs here, and from the left atrium from the right pulmonary vein, right lungs here. And so we can't see the openings for those. They'd be behind the back here. So if we go back to this diagram, this is showing the left atrium here. So I'll draw that in red. And then the right pulmonary veins would be here. So the arrow is showing blood flow returning to the left atrium. So we'll put left atrium over here. And pulmonary veins returning oxygenated blood, that's why it's red, from the lungs. Right and left lungs. So those are the receiving chambers. How does blood flow into what's sending the blood into the atria? What causes blood to move? Pressure, all right? So the origin of this pressure are the ventricles contracting. And that creates the origin of the pressure. So the pressure is pushing the blood through the body, through the lungs, back to the heart. So atrial pressure, as you'll see next week, atrial pressure, is there ever a time when atrial pressure is going to be higher than aortic pressure or pulmonary trunk pressure? No. Because then blood would be flowing away from the heart instead of towards the heart in the receiving chambers. Okay? And that's not compatible with life. All right, before we follow the blood through to the ventricles, let's look at some other structures that we associate with the atria. You'll notice on your models, if I could borrow yours again. Thank you. Actually, if we can keep it, there's another one up here. So on the models, there's a small little flap associated with each of the atria. This little thing right here, a little cauliflower kind of corrugation here, and on the left atrium, it would be this little structure right here. Those are known as auricles, kind of like your ear flaps, which are called auricles. And if you open one of those up and look on its inner surface, you'll notice ridges. Right? These are muscles that really aren't necessary for the function of the atria. You guys can share this one when I'm done. If you were to cut that part of the atrial wall off, they would not be noticeable. So it's this region right here and right here. And this is showing the pectinate muscle. All right? So when I ask for structures like that on the lab quiz or lab exam, if I were to just have a label here, you wouldn't know if I was saying the endocardium or the left atrium or whatever. So I usually give you the hint that I want the muscle by saying identify these ridges of cardiac muscle. Okay, we have different ridges in the ventricles. So on both the right and the left atria, we have pectinate muscle. Now the last structure that we associate with the atria, and it's seen predominantly in the wall of the left atrium, is this area that you see right here. It's kind of thin. It really isn't just a different color like that in our hearts, but it's thin, and it has a thickened ridge along the upper surface here. And that, after the baby is born, is called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis, we say the adult term. This is actually seen in children. So I'm going to pass this part around. This would be the atrial septum right here, the wall between the two right and left atria. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see an oval region that is thin and not colored pink with the muscle fibers. And that's the fossa ovalis. It's easier to find on the right atrium, but you can't have a door without seeing it on both sides. Okay? So in fetal life, we talked about the pressure aspect, okay? And the fact that the oxygen is being added to the blood in the placenta. Therefore, all of the blood doesn't have to go to the lungs. Some of it does. Why does any blood have to go to the lungs if the oxygen is being obtained at the placenta? We still need oxygen. It's still growing. We're still developing lung tissue. All right, so we still have to send blood there as if it was any other tissue. But it doesn't have to all go there. It would be a waste of time. And so we have a couple of areas where blood flowing out of the right ventricle to the lungs can escape that, or not even out of the right ventricle, but on its way to the lungs, can escape that and bypass the lungs. And this is the first site. So blood coming from the inferior vena cava flowing in here is already oxygenated, right, in the fetus? Because it's picked up the oxygen from the placental tissue already. And this is like a doggy door. It actually grows as two separate walls, kind of towards each other like this. And there's a gap. When the lungs are developing, they're filled with fluid, pressure is higher actually in the lungs than it is in the rest of the body. So as blood is coming up the inferior vena cava, and it has the opportunity to go through this gap to the left atrium, rather than into the right ventricle where pressure is higher, it will do so. And so in the fetus, that's an opening known as the foramen ovale, just like we had in the skull. Right? After the baby's born and we have that drop in pressure in the lungs, now it becomes easier to go to the lungs. So after the baby is born, the blood no longer flows through there, it flows into the right ventricle, and this grows shut in a couple of days, and it's called a fossa ovalis. Until it grows shut, there's a bit of backflow of blood, and the baby may have a heart murmur. Okay, and the doctor said, don't worry about it, it'll disappear in a couple of days. That's what he's talking about. Sometimes it doesn't disappear. I was telling this morning class, I had an old boyfriend, and by old he's in his 60s, but this is when I was 19. I met him through my sister. It's a hilarious story, but anyway, they had written letters as 2 or 3 girls and a guy had written letters to their favorite teacher, their drama teacher and speech class teacher, pretending to be some newt-like salamander creature that lived in the forest, and they called themselves Og. And they did this over a period of 2 or 3 months. They would leave him letters in the library, and on his birthday, they were going to take him, they reveal themselves and take him out for his birthday to buy them some running shoes. And since he didn't know me, I was a junior in college, I was elected to be the one to pick him up. But I couldn't talk. So I showed at the door this total stranger and motioned for him to come to the car, and he's nervous and I'm nervous, and it's just kind of, he's like, can't we just go out for ice cream instead of this? And I'm shaking my head no, and I've got classes, whatever. Anyway, we dated off and on for about 10 years. I last saw him in '89. So I first got Facebook a couple of years ago. You know how you look through, my kids call it face stalking, it's like, who are your friends now? Do I know any of your friends, And so every once in a while I'll find somebody that's from my past and then see who their friends are and see if we have anybody in common. And another old boyfriend isn't on Facebook yet, so I keep looking for him though. And so about a month or so after Christmas in 2010, I found this guy. I knew it was him because he only had 6 friends, and 3 of them were classmates of my sister. So I knew he was the guy that was from Maryland, but he was in New York. So I sent him a friend request. A whole year went by, and he never answered. And I was just like, well, he's like me, he never looks at Facebook. Or maybe he doesn't want to be my friend. I mean, it's been 25 years. So March, April of last year, I get this notice on an email that he had honored my friend request and I was now his friend. So I thought, cool. So I open it up and he's written this little note. All of a sudden now he has like 360 friends because he hadn't answered anybody's friend request. And he'd had tons of, he was a great teacher and lots of kids, remembered him still. And so there's this note. I don't know how I got this Facebook account. I don't do Facebook. I don't know how to use it. If you want to talk to me, here's my email. And I'll be shutting this down in a few weeks. Well, he has a stepdaughter who is still keeping it up and answering everybody's Facebook messages and sharing it with him annually. But I answered his email, and we exchanged 2 or 3 emails over a month and caught up, and now I haven't talked to him since May of last year. But he shared that he might have some spelling errors in his email because he had had a PFO and several mini strokes. I'm going, PFO? I'm in the health area. I'm anatomy and physiologist. What's a PFO? So let's Google. I type in PFO. PFO is patent foramen ovale. In the 60s, he had, what you can see if that's partially open, and you have blood leaking back and forth and can settle and the platelets start sticking and little clots form and get pumped to the brain, and it caused his many strokes. He was born as a preemie. and back in the 40s, late 40s, and the treatment was to increase the oxygen, but oxygen is a toxin, it's a poison, and many babies went blind because the blood vessels to protect the cells in the eye would constrict, and that would cause the neurons to die, and they would be blind. That had happened to him, but in just one eye. And he was a medical phenomena because of it. And so I knew all of that, but I didn't realize, and he didn't, that he still had this open, partially open flap in his heart. And because of the disturbance in the blood flow, that had allowed blood to settle in various areas, and little clots to form, and finally several of them had lodged in his brain. Over a period of time, the clots had formed enough to dislodge and had caused the small blockage areas to his brain, and he was having trouble moving his fingers and spelling words while he was typing. So it's like, I just hadn't thought of a patent foramen ovale. I mean, kids, babies, yes, it's usually repaired by then because it can cause difficulty with oxygenation. Kids, toddlers that aren't getting enough oxygen will often squat. They'll run around and play, and all of a sudden they'll just sit and squat. And it's a particular characteristic of that. They'll have a blue tinge to their skin, and so they usually, their parents will take them in, and they'll find things like this and get it fixed. So once it's closed, it's called fossa ovalis. All right. So we'll do fetal circulation when we're near the end of blood vessels, and we'll talk about the fetal structures versus the adult remnants. And this is one of those adult remnants of what was a fetal structure. All right. So we'll put a black dotted line here as the fossa ovalis. It's easier to see on the right side, but it's present on the left side as well. Okay. So you can see a little bit of it here on the left side. Now, depending on how you cut open your sheep hearts on Tuesday, you may or may not see it. If you cut right through the middle of it, it's kind of hard to find. But if you cut a flap in the right atrium, similar to this view, it's a little easier to find it. All right, so we have blood flowing into the right atrium, blood flowing into the left atrium. Now let's take it through to the ventricles. So when the heart is at rest, neither atria are contracting, neither atrium is contracting. Blood is going to flow at the same time that it's flowing into the atrium. It's going to go right on through the valves and flow into the ventricles. Okay? That cardiac cycle and sequences we'll talk about on Thursday next week. So, we have a set of valves separating each, I'm going to finish up my heart here, separating each atrium from the ventricle. On the right side, each valve has 3 leaflets. Just kind of drawing in 2 here. And so these leaflets, as valves, separate the atrium from the ventricle, so they're known as atrioventricular valves. They have other names, which might be easier to spell, but harder to remember which is which. Because for the atrioventricular valve, all you have to remember is it's the right atrioventricular valve or it's the left atrioventricular valve. Okay? So the structures that are going to pass through here will be the left atrioventricular valve. Now, when I write a question about it, I'm going to make an abbreviation and call it the AV valve, but you guys already know you have to write the entire thing out when you write an answer for a lab quiz or exam. Okay, so the left atrioventricular valve, and on the right side, can I erase this list so you guys in the back can see it? Everybody has this down? Okay. I didn't hear anybody shouting no. So the right atrioventricular valve has three leaflets, and the left atrioventricular valve has two. So if we look here at the valve, we'll get up to here. So here are the atrioventricular valves. On the right side there are three. 1, 2, 3. On the left, there are just two. So another name for the right atrioventricular valve is the tricuspid valve. And similarly, another name for the left atrioventricular valve is bicuspid. And as those two cusps come together, for somebody they look like the bishop's mitre they wear on top of their head. So it's also known as the mitral valve. The reason I even mentioned that second one is because there is a condition known as mitral stenosis, where the valves thicken and they don't meet very well, and blood can leak back when the ventricles are contracting and pushing blood out of the ventricle. It actually goes back up into the atrium. Or you can have mitral valve prolapse, in which the valve turns inside out, and again, blood flows back into the atrium instead of out the ventricle. Okay, so just so you'll know what the word mitral refers to, it's referring to the left atrioventricular valve. Now notice the angle, here's the right atrioventricular valve. So this would be the valve leaflet. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. And the left atrioventricular valve has 2, like I indicated. Now notice we also have on the valve these strings. Ever heard of heartstrings? There really are heartstrings. And these are, the valve is formed of dense irregular connective tissue. It's going to be covered by the endocardium. And the strings are just bands of collagen fibers. And they are attached to a mound of cardiac muscle extending up out of the ventricular wall. And somebody thought these looked like small mammary glands, and so they are identified as papillary muscles, all right, from the word paps. So a better view you can see here would be the papillary muscle. Here would be papillary muscle, right? So the purpose of these, chordae tendineae and paps, and I'll write those words on the board. So attached to the valve are the cords or heartstrings known as tendinous cords or chordae tendineae. We have them present on both sides. And they're attached between the valves and the papillary muscle. So here's another muscle that starts with P. You need to remember that pectinate muscle is in the atrium and papillary muscle is in the ventricle. Okay? So how does this work? Notice the direction of the valves. The valves are oriented so that as pressure is higher in the atria, that's going to push open the valves, and blood is going to continue to flow into the ventricles. All right, so when the valves are open, they're hanging down into the ventricle. Now, the ventricle starts to contract. We have a chamber. We're making the diameter or the volume of that chamber smaller. What's happening to pressure within that chamber? It's increasing. So pressure increases in the chamber and pushes on these valve leaflets and pushes them together. All right? Now what's going to happen to pressure? It's going to go up really fast because the valve going out of the heart, the valves going out of the heart are closed as well. With that higher pressure, here's what can happen. Pressure builds up under the leaflets, And they turn inside out and open into the atrium, where we're trying to block blood from going into the atria. That's the prolapse. All right. So to keep that from happening, we have these chordae tendineae. The papillary muscles don't close the valves. That's the role of the blood pressure. Okay. The papillary muscles function to adjust the tension as the pressure changes in the ventricle. So because the ventricle can create such high pressure, we need to keep these valves from turning inside out. And you can look at the direction of the valve to see the direction of blood flow. It's supposed to go from atrium to ventricle. Okay? Okay. I'm going to make this chamber, sorry for erasing it, I'm just going to make it bigger. Now we need to leave the ventricles. Well, one more structure, all right? See this irregular surface right here? Those are the cardiac muscle ridges of the ventricles. And these are known as trabecular carni. And that plasticized heart that's going around, you can see how irregular it is. Forming flow, you can also see how the blood flow isn't constant. This is a lot of areas for blood to settle in and form a clot. Seems rather dangerous to me, but that's the way our hearts are. And so it means meaty cords. I don't know if you remember the old Taco Bell ads where the lion's growling, carni. That means meat. Okay? So trabecular carni are these muscle ridges of the ventricles. So the atria have pectinate muscles. The ventricles have the papillary muscle and the trabecular carni. All right. Any questions on that? So we've taken, on the oxygenated blood, we've taken blood from the head that's given up oxygen to the brain, brought it into the right atrium via the superior vena cava. It's gone through the right atrium, through the atrioventricular valve, the right atrioventricular valve, into the right ventricle. Okay? And now we need to get it out of the ventricle, and where is it going to go? To the lungs. Okay, because it gave up most of its oxygen to the brain. So now it's going to go to the lungs. So looking from the anterior surface of the right ventricle, we see this vessel rising up out of the right ventricle and giving off a branch to the left lung and a branch to the right lung. You can see it here. All right, so rising out of the right ventricle, we have this vessel known as the pulmonary trunk. And it's going to divide and give off two vessels. One's going to go to the right lung, so we have a right pulmonary artery. And one's going to go to the left lung, so we have a left pulmonary artery. Notice, artery. But I drew it in blue because it's carrying, it's called an artery because it's going away from the heart. It's under high pressure. So it's going to have the thicker wall, the tighter concentric symmetry of the smooth muscle cells, even though it's deoxygenated blood. Right? In the fetus, we see this as the two umbilical arteries. Carry blood from the fetus to the placenta. They're arteries, but they're going away from the heart to get oxygen and coming back as a single umbilical vein. So again, we'll describe that. You don't need to know it for now. We'll describe it when we get to fetal circulation. The vessel carrying blood away from the left ventricle is known as the aorta. Okay? Can I erase this list of stuff here? I'm getting close to the bottom. So once it's in the aorta, it's going to the body. Once it's in the pulmonary trunk, it's going to the lungs. They're both arterial structures. They're both thick-walled. About an inch or so partially up into the aorta, all right? It has to go through, or the pulmonary trunk, it has to go through another set of valves. So look in your hearts and see if you can find these structures, okay? So, again, superior vena cava. Blood flows into the right atrium, through the right atrioventricular valve to the right ventricle. Blood from the pulmonary veins is flowing into the left atrium and through the left atrioventricular valve to the left ventricle. All right? Both ventricles contract at the same time. The valves close. To leave the right ventricle, it has to go through the pulmonary semilunar valve to get into the pulmonary trunk. Up high, because it's in the middle of the heart, so you have to look up underneath here in the left ventricle, is the aortic semilunar valve. Okay? And that then is going to, so there's a period of time when both the atrioventricular valves are closed and the pulmonary